What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a little different with a conversation about the history and legacy of the Neverwinter series of video games, including a little about both MMOs. This is a type of video I like to do after I finish reviewing games in a series, where I can talk about a few things that don't necessarily fit into the reviews themselves, but the first thing I want to lead this video with is that this is not a documentary or anything. This is largely just observations from actually playing the games, along with some of the influences they might have given to the industry as a whole. So with no further ado, let's actually jump into this thing, and the interesting beginnings of Neverwinter, you might think, start with the 2002 release of Neverwinter Nights. However, that would be incorrect. The original Neverwinter Nights was a 1991 MMO. This particular game, while bearing no particular correlation to the later games, outside of the name of course, and it holds the position of the very first graphical MMO. There were text-based online games previous to this. However, Neverwinter Nights, the 1991 version, was the first of these to have actual graphics associated with it. And this was done via the Gold Box engine. If you're unfamiliar with the Gold Box engine, it is the prelude to the Infinity engine, which many more people are familiar with, as it was used to create games like Baldur's Gate 1, 2, Icewind Dale, Planescape Torment, etc. Well, prior to that, there was the Gold Box engine, which was a combination of text and then a graphical battle system. It was used to create, I think it was like 15 or so different games, some of which were quite popular, such as the Pools of Radiance. Now, like most MMOs from this area, the player size was very modest, but it ran from 1991 to 1997, when it was finally shut down by AOL. AOL, or America Online, was a company that provided dial-up internet service back when the internet still used phone lines for communication as opposed to the broadband networks that we're used to these days. In terms of this video and the broader legacy of these games, I think the thing to keep in mind here was that it established a community around Neverwinter Nights that then persisted after the game was eventually shut down. The game had nonetheless grew to be somewhat popular actually by 1997 with about 115,000 players, which is nothing by today's standards, but in those early days of the internet was a very substantial number. And that audience in particular really is what Neverwinter Nights from 2002 was attempting to capture, albeit with some newer technology. In this particular story, if you will, there is really no bigger title than Neverwinter Nights from 2002. And it's an interesting game in a lot of ways that I think in some ways was surpassed later on, but nonetheless it's hard to find the exact unique blend of the things that Neverwinter Nights did, because that game was a platform for community content and sort of private server MMOs, if you will, that led it to be much loved. This particular game was developed by BioWare, and in addition to coming with the normal single-player campaign, if you will, where you played as a citizen of Neverwinter trying to combat the Wailing Death, which was a plague going around, and unraveling that mystery, the game also shipped with the Aurora toolset, which allowed you to potentially make your own custom content. This took primarily two forms: custom modules as well as persistent worlds. Custom modules are pretty much what you would expect. They were player-made campaigns that could be downloaded, installed, and played, either by yourself or with other players, as the game did have some multiplayer aspects to it, which of course led to the persistent worlds. If you're familiar with modern-day private servers for MMOs, the concept is not dissimilar, but basically, people would use the toolset, make their own custom world, if you will, that then became a sort of self-contained MMO where people could role-play out whatever Dungeons & Dragons or related thing they wanted. And this was exceedingly popular, actually. The amount of custom content far, far outshines the official content, if you will. And it's quite hard to downplay how incredibly popular this was. In fact, it was popular enough to spawn a sequel, Neverwinter Nights 2. Now, unfortunately, Neverwinter Nights 2 never quite lived up to its predecessor's name. In some ways, there were a lot of improvements in Neverwinter Nights 2, such as the switch to the D&D 3.5 rule set from 3rd edition that the original Neverwinter Nights used, and things like upgraded visuals, that type of stuff. But the sequel, Neverwinter Nights 2, was in fact made by Obsidian, actually, which I think is worth mentioning because the main campaign of Neverwinter Nights 2 differs a lot from the original Neverwinter Nights. In the original, the main campaign kind of served more as a tech demo in some ways, where it was kind of just showing off what you could do with the tool set, as opposed to the second game's actual big campaign that was telling a story and tried some interesting things, some of which worked, some of which didn't, but it felt like you were actually playing a game rather than, again, almost a demo. However, as I mentioned, Neverwinter Nights 2 never saw a lot of that widespread adoption from the first game, which comes down to a few different things, but generally speaking, the reasons you'll see for this are the bugs at launch. Neverwinter Nights 2 had a very rough, buggy launch, and second, the toolset was overall harder to use. And in some cases, there were just things missing, that type of stuff, that made it more difficult to make a lot of custom content. So all of those things, combined with the fact that the people interested in doing that had likely already made exactly that in Neverwinter Nights, led to a slower rate of adoption. However, that's not to say that it was unpopular. You can still find to this day about 100 or so custom modules that people still play and have a good time in with Neverwinter Nights 2. However, the persistent worlds are harder to get into, which brings me to my next part of this video, and that is the way these games have sort of aged, if you will. As you might imagine, running servers and that kind of thing costs money, so the multiplayer portions of both these games were eventually put to rest, if you will. The functionality no longer worked. However, the original game, Neverwinter Nights, received an enhanced edition not all that long ago, which actually restored a lot of that functionality, which means to this day, you can go play in Neverwinter Nights persistent worlds. There's all sorts of easily downloadable content directly from the game. You can pull up a menu, download modules you want to play, check out persistent worlds, that type of stuff. For Neverwinter Nights 2, there was apparently a problem with getting the source code for an enhanced edition, so we're just probably never going to get this. And as a result, that functionality does not work natively. You can restore it by downloading a mod or two, but even if you did that and jumped through those hoops, the scene, if you will, is just not as large. There's not as much going on there multiplayer-wise, which I think is kind of helped along by the fact that the main campaigns for Neverwinter Nights 2 are much better than their predecessors, but nonetheless, as a result, the longevity of Neverwinter Nights 2 suffered a great deal in comparison to the first game. So as you can see here, the lifespan of this game is largely dictated by the amount of community content available for it that people made rather endlessly, which I don't think is any surprise then to see games like Skyrim, for instance, go on for a decade after its release with people still actively modding that game and making content for people to enjoy, which I think has been the bread and butter of Skyrim YouTubers at this point. But I mention that because the market for that is still there, which we're going to roll back around to here in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the next game in the Neverwinter series, which was actually the Neverwinter MMO that originally released in, I want to say, 2013, at least on PC, and then it came to consoles later. But the Neverwinter MMO, just titled Neverwinter as opposed to Neverwinter Nights, is, as you might imagine, a bit of a different type of game. This is, in a lot of ways, a more traditional MMO. However, it's very action-oriented, the combat's pretty fast and fluid. However, it still has all the trappings of Dungeons & Dragons that you might expect. It is, nonetheless, I think, worth checking out, especially since it's free to play. You can just jump in right now and play it if you want. However, I wouldn't spend a lot of time there. At the end of the day, they release these modules semi-regularly. I think the last one was like in June. And those modules always kind of reset, if you will, the baseline for content and progression, which means that every so often, the game just kind of invalidates all of the grinding and progress you've been doing. So unless you just really love that kind of thing, I wouldn't spend too long with the Neverwinter MMO. But nonetheless, it covers the sort of basics of what an MMO is alongside the Neverwinter name. Which brings me to my main point about the MMO, and that is all of the modules. So the overall story of that MMO is rather disjointed because D&D in general tends to be more of a setting for stories to take place in rather than a cohesive story, meaning that there are a ton of disjointed campaigns in Neverwinter, and in that way I think it kind of follows up on what you would expect from D&D, which is all kinds of stories taking place. And because of this, the amount of content in Neverwinter is at this point pretty ridiculous. It's almost 10 years old. They release modules all the time, and most people will likely never see all of them. And in that way, I think it's pretty similar to its predecessors, despite having theoretically more in common with the 1991 release of Neverwinter Nights. So now that we've discussed all of those games, I wanted to talk about a few more points here in the back half and the legacy of them as a whole. So I think if you've been paying attention to this whole video, the common thread that unites all of the Neverwinter games is online multiplayer, which isn't exactly a surprise as a lot of these games are developed and made when that type of content was kind of hitting its apex. The original Neverwinter Nights released before WoW was even released. The first Neverwinter Nights game from 1991 was literally the first graphical MMO. However, I think it's pretty obvious that these days almost every single one of these games, at least in the online multiplayer space, has been eclipsed by the games that followed it. Obviously, none of these are the biggest of the big in terms of online multiplayer games, but nonetheless, they are tied very deeply to that genre. And in some ways, they did a lot of groundbreaking stuff that then led to further innovations down the line. And while, like most things in the video game industry, I don't think you could chalk up everything to these games, but they are nonetheless a historic bit of software that then led to further innovation and tech being used to scratch an itch that people had, which brings me to, I would say, the last point of this video, and that is when we look at the things Neverwinter Nights did for gaming just as a series, and then look at more recent things, for instance, like Skyrim and its incredibly long-lived life thanks to mods, as well as the practice of just hosting private servers for MMOs, I think the true legacy of these games, if you will, is that they showed that there was a will and a market for content that was made by the community and ran by the community that has since not really been replicated. And in some ways, I don't even really expect it to be done by further Neverwinter games, as I think it's unlikely we'll see more of them. However, I think potentially we might see that legacy carried forward in a much fancier version of Neverwinter Nights, if you will, that utilizes technology and ease of use of the engine and development tools for people to create their own custom content. Because again, that market is there, and I think in the future, we might find a way to merge those in a way that makes sense and creates more incredibly unique content. Because if there's any takeaway from this series, and honestly just gaming as a whole, is that, again, that's clearly something people want. People are modding Skyrim to this day for a reason, creating all this unique content, doing overhaul mods, and we saw that same thing with the Neverwinter series. So looking forward, I think it's not unreasonable to think of a future where you might merge those two things as technology advances and these things become theoretically easier to do. Though, of course, here in reality, and outside of theoreticals, making games is a very difficult thing to do. So creating a tool set in which these things are possible comes with exorbitant costs. And simply because of that and the rather specialized roles that go into game development, this is not something I would expect to happen anytime soon, but my point is that it's possible. And the fact that I even think it's possible is because of games like the Neverwinter series. And over the next few decades of my life, I'm excited to see where this goes and whether or not we ever get there. But that, I think, is where I'm going to wrap up this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I think it's an interesting topic, and sometimes I feel the need to talk about things and how they impact the industry as a whole rather than individual games. But if you enjoyed it, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.